So hi everyone, and welcome to our first Get SFU Ready Q&A session for new international graduate students starting their studies at SFU in September 2020. Just to introduce myself, my name is Jean Lomas. I'm an international student advisor, immigration specialist at SFU. I'd just like to start by congratulating you all on your admission to SFU. And no matter where you are in the world right now or where you'll be when you start your studies with us, we're really excited to welcome you to our SFU community. So just to start, I thought it would be helpful to go over our agenda for the day. We're going to start so first of all, today's session is going to focus on immigration and enrollment requirements for new international grad students. I'm going to start with a brief overview of our services here at the International Services for Students, or ISS office. I'll then move on to cover some basic information about the study permit application process, as well as enrollment requirements for international graduate students at SFU, specifically as they pertain to Canadian immigration regulations. So check with your department if you have questions about how to enroll in your fall courses, but we'll talk about it from the immigration perspective. We'll then move on to some very important COVID-19 related updates before we open the floor to questions from you. For those who registered for the live session, I will also be sending an email after we say goodbye, probably tomorrow, with a few resources to help you navigate everything we discussed. I also wanted to highlight just one extremely important point for you to keep in mind as we move into the content. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all of us in the past few months in a variety of ways, you might say countless ways. So because this situation is really unprecedented and has caused a lot of uncertainty, I know that you might have many questions and you're eager to have them answered. And thank you, by the way, to those of you who submitted your questions in advance of the session. In today's session, we'll cover as many of those questions as we can. But please keep in mind that the scope of our session today lies specifically within the realm of Canadian immigration policy. As the situation with COVID-19 continues to evolve, and things are always changing, especially when it comes to immigration policy, I may not have all the answers for you today, and those I do have may change or may be changing as we speak. Wouldn't that be exciting? So the information I share with you today is current to the best of my knowledge as of today's date, which for those of you watching the recording is July 23rd, 2020. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's move on. So as I mentioned, I work in the International Services for Students, or ISS office at SFU, and I'm so lucky to be part of an amazing team. A little bit about what we do at ISS: we offer a range of non-academic services to help support your transition to SFU as an international student. So these include immigration information, including information on your study permit, your visa, and any work permits you may require, as well as employment regulations for international students in Canada. 3 of our international student advisors are immigration specialists and are regulated Canadian immigration consultants, which means we're licensed to provide this type of advice. We can advise you on medical insurance and navigating the Canadian healthcare system, transition support and intercultural programming. And we also have our study abroad team who work with students going on exchange or field school programs. You can also see our contact information on this slide. Our international student advisors offer advising via email, live chat, which is like an online messenger system, virtual advising appointments via Zoom, and to a lesser extent by phone. Note that the phone line is not staffed currently, so no one will pick up, but we are checking messages. Currently, we're closed for in-person services and are all working remotely, which incidentally is why you might see my cat jump into the frame at some point. Apologies if she does. So another great resource, and probably the first one I would really strongly encourage you to access when you have questions, is actually our website, where you can find welcome guides to help navigate your transition to SFU, and 40 different instruction guides covering a wide range of topics, including step-by-step instructions on how to apply for or extend your immigration documents, information on medical insurance, as well as enrollment requirements, work eligibility, and more. They're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on our website, so they may save you some time if you don't want to wait for an appointment or an email response. Not that we don't love to hear from you, we absolutely do, but we also want to ensure you can access information in the most convenient way possible. Moving on. So to start on the topic of immigration, I thought it would be helpful to briefly go over the topic of study permit applications, since this is top of mind for many of you at this time, especially as you're considering the implications of starting your program online. So first, I just wanted everyone to be aware that you must be holding a valid study permit for all in-Canada components of your program. Due to COVID-19, some visa offices and visa application centers are temporarily closed. However, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, is still accepting and processing study permit applications. Applications must be submitted online. IRCC has also expressed that they recognize the challenges faced by applicants in gathering certain supporting documents, such as medical exam results, police certificates, completing biometrics enrollment as part of the application process. IRCC has confirmed that applications won't be refused for non-compliance due to failure to complete certain necessary steps, including medical exams or biometrics enrollment. If you're planning to have your family members accompany you to Canada, you may apply for their documents, for example, a visitor visa or an open work permit for your spouse or common law partner, study permits for any school-aged children, or visitor visas for younger children at the same time with your study permit application. Now, if you will be starting your studies online from outside of Canada, which I know will be the case for many of you, a study permit is not required for the period of time you're outside Canada. However, this will be needed when you're physically here. So depending on your nationality, in addition to your study permit, you also may be required to hold a valid temporary resident visa or an electronic travel authorization known as an ETA to enter Canada, unless you're exempt from both of those documents. When applying for a study permit outside Canada, a visa or ETA will be issued to you automatically upon approval of your study permit application if you require one. You will also be issued a study permit approval letter known as the letter of introduction, which you'll need to carry with you when you travel to the Canadian port of entry, and that's where the permit itself will be issued. So your study permit is a status document. So what that means is that it allows you to remain in Canada for the period of time indicated on the permit. You must ensure that your study permit is valid for the duration of your stay in Canada, which may mean that you need to apply to extend it from within Canada if it will expire before you complete your program. We recommend applying for an extension a few months before your study permit expires, and you can find instructions on that process on our website. Now, if you're already holding a valid study permit and you're joining SFU after attending another institution in Canada, you don't need to obtain a new study permit, provided that yours is still valid, but you will need to notify IRCC of the change to your school but by completing an online process called the Designated Learning Institution, or DLI, transfer process. So moving on, and I see that there are some questions coming into the chat box already, which is great. We'll get to those in the Q&A portion of the session, so just bear with me. So as far as enrollment requirements go, it's also important to be aware of your obligations as a study permit holder in Canada once you're here. So while you're holding a study permit, you're expected to comply with your conditions, your study permit conditions, by actively pursuing your studies in Canada and making reasonable progress towards completion of your program of study. From IRCC's perspective, this means that you must remain enrolled in each academic session during your studies in Canada. As a graduate student at SFU, you're expected to maintain year-round enrollment at SFU unless you're approved for a leave of absence. Keep in mind that from the immigration perspective, this leave should not exceed 150 days. If it does, you'll need to change your immigration status. For example, apply for visitor status to comply with the conditions of your stay in Canada. If you are planning to take a leave, it's always a good idea to talk to an international student advisor for advice on how to ensure that you can maintain compliance with the immigration regulations and that you're aware of any other considerations with respect to your plans. Your study permit will also allow you to legally work on or off campus under certain circumstances. So to work on campus, you must be enrolled full-time at SFU in the term you wish to work. You must also hold a valid study permit, and that permit must include a condition printed on the document stating that you may work or may accept employment. To work off campus, in addition to being enrolled full-time and holding a valid study permit with work conditions, you must also be enrolled in a program at SFU that is at least 6 months in length and leads to a degree, diploma, or certificate. There is a limit to the number of hours you may work off campus. Generally, you can work no more than 20 hours per week, but you can work full-time during scheduled breaks. So for example, breaks between full-time terms. You can find more details about how SFU defines a scheduled break on the enrollment requirements page of our website. You'll also require a valid social insurance number, also known as a SIN, for any work you do in Canada. So this is a number that's used for tax purposes, and it's required in order for your employer to pay you. When your study permit is issued at the port of entry, it's always a good idea to check the conditions on the document to make sure that there is a condition stating that you can work, and ask for it to be added if it's not there, provided that you will be enrolled full-time and you'll meet the eligibility requirements to work. Because without that condition on your study permit, you won't be able to start working or apply for a social insurance number. It's easier to get it changed upon arrival if you can, than try and go through the process to get it changed later on. So aside from on and or off-campus work performed under the authorization of your study permit, if your program involves a mandatory co-op, internship, or practicum term, which I know many graduate programs do, you will also require a valid co-op work permit in order to do the work if it's in Canada. If your letter of acceptance from SFU indicates your program includes a mandatory work component, you can actually apply for this work permit at the same time as you apply for your study permit. There will be an item in your checklist asking for evidence of work requirement and study, and you can include the page of your acceptance letter that references the practicum or internship or co-op. If your acceptance letter does not include that information, or if you didn't apply for a co-op work permit as part of your study permit application, you'll be able to obtain a letter from the co-op or internship coordinator in your department after you arrive in Canada, and then you'll be able to submit an inland application for a co-op work permit. So all is not lost if you did not do it prior to starting. After you complete your SFU program, you may also be eligible for a post-graduation work permit of up to 3 years in length if you were continuously enrolled full-time throughout your program, with possible exceptions made in the case of an authorized leave of less than 150 days or part-time enrollment in your final term of studies only. Again, for anything aside from full-time enrollment, we suggest that you check with our office in advance so we can discuss potential implications with regard to things like the post-graduation work permit, as well as work eligibility during your studies. So with that all said, and without further ado, let's move on to the topic I know we've all been waiting for, otherwise known as the elephant in the room, COVID-19 updates. We have received many questions from you about the impacts of COVID-19 on your plans to study in Canada. Fortunately, we've received some positive updates from IRCC just in the last week or so. So I'm very happy to share those with you, hot off the presses. So first, on July 14th, IRCC announced some temporary measures to better facilitate online learning for international students. They confirmed that complete online study permit applications, which include all the necessary documents, will be prioritized to ensure that the applications will be processed as quickly as possible. And in addition, for those applications that may be incomplete due to circumstances beyond your control, and in recognition of the challenges faced by many applicants who are unable to gather all the necessary documents or complete required steps like biometrics, getting police certificates, having a medical exam to complete your application, IRCC has also implemented a temporary two-stage approval process for students starting in the fall term who submit study permit applications before September 15th of this year. The two-stage approval process will include a first stage of receiving an approval in principle and the second stage of full approval once all of the outstanding documents and necessary steps are completed. The details on this process were released yesterday, so it's a good thing the session was today. Here's how IRCC says it will work. So your first step will be to apply with as many of the documents required for a complete application as possible. You should also include a letter of explanation for any documents that are missing due to COVID-19. IRCC will process complete applications first as part of their prioritization process. And for those who do not submit a complete application, they will process your application in two stages. In stage one, they'll check your eligibility for a study permit. So an officer will be reviewing your application to make sure you have a letter of acceptance from SFU, as well as proof that you have enough money to pay your tuition, your living expenses for yourself, and any accompanying family members, as well as return transportation for yourself and any accompanying family members. They'll also look at any family ties you may have to Canada and to your home country, as well as any evidence that you'll leave Canada at the end of your authorized stay. And this is really key to any application for temporary residence in Canada. You need to be able to demonstrate that you have an incentive to return home once your status expires. So if your application passes that first stage, IRCC will let you know in your online account. So this is the approval in principle. It doesn't guarantee that your application will receive final approval, but it gives you some reassurance that you are eligible for a study permit as long as you pass the second stage. So in stage two, IRCC will check your application for admissibility and any changes that might have happened to your eligibility. So they'll review your application at that point for a medical exam and/or police certificates if needed. They'll check to see if they have your biometrics, which just to be clear is your fingerprints and photo. And they'll check for any information that might have changed after they reviewed your application for eligibility in stage one, just to make sure you still meet those. If your application passes that second stage, they've said they will approve the application. So that new two-stage process will only apply to study permit applications submitted by September 15th, 2020, and for programs that are starting in 2020, so spring, summer, or fall 2020. So for that reason, I recommend you apply as soon as possible for your study permit if you haven't already. Also, according to the IRCC website, after you apply for your study permit, any time spent studying online from outside Canada will now count toward your eligibility for a post-graduation work permit, as well as being factored into the length of the work permit, which I know is an important thing for many of you. So for this time to count, you must make sure that you complete at least 50% of your program in Canada. So there is an expectation that you'll come here at some point to study. You must apply for the study permit by September 15th. And start your program in spring, summer, or fall 2020. So they've confirmed that students who meet those requirements won't have time deducted from the length of their work permit for studies completed while outside Canada until December 31st, 2020. Keep in mind you must spend at least 50% of your program studying in Canada in order to be eligible for a post-graduation work permit. And that's actually always been the case for the post-graduation work permit. Lastly, with regard to processing times and biometrics, unfortunately, as many of you have been experiencing, processing has been disrupted by COVID-19, so this has meant longer processing times than often what you'll see listed on the IRCC website. For biometrics, you can only give your biometrics after submitting your application and receiving a biometrics instruction letter. As you're probably aware, biometrics collection is suspended in many areas of the world, including within Canada. So if you're unable to give biometrics at this time, you won't receive a final decision on your application yet, although you might receive approval in principle. If, on the other hand, you're in Canada, IRCC has announced a temporary policy exempting in Canada applicants from giving biometrics. So if that applies to you, your application can be finalized without that step. hopefully that's good news for some of you, as I did note from the registration survey that a few of you are in Canada right now and needing to extend your existing study permits. So another topic we're receiving a lot of questions about is travel restrictions. This is a really tricky topic to advise on, since the travel restrictions have tended to be implemented and extended in small increments of 1 month or so at a time. So again, I want to stress that the information I provide today may change without notice. To manage the outbreak of COVID-19, the Government of Canada has implemented travel restrictions to prevent most foreign nationals from entering Canada unless they meet one of the exemptions outlined in the applicable order in council. So we actually have two sets of travel restrictions in Canada that are handled separately. One is specific to any foreign nationals seeking to enter Canada from the United States, and the other is for foreign nationals seeking to enter Canada from any other country aside from the United States. So the travel restrictions on entry from the United States have just been extended to August 21st, 2020, and restrictions on entry from countries other than the United States are currently in place until July 31st, 2020. Just to be clear, this does not necessarily mean restrictions will be lifted after those dates. It seems to me quite likely at this point that they'll be extended. However, it's also possible we'll see some changes to the specific details. We'll likely have more information to share about this at our travel consideration session coming up on August 7th, which I hope some of you will be able to attend. So under the current travel restrictions, the requirements students must meet in order to be exempt. So for those of you who intend to travel here from the United States, if you are planning to come to Canada at this time, you must meet the following requirements. So first, you must have a credible quarantine plan in place. More on that in a minute. And second, you must be traveling to Canada for an essential or non-discretionary purpose. And we'll dive into that also in a minute. So if you'll be traveling to Canada from any other country other than the United States, in addition to meeting those first two requirements, so you still need the quarantine plan, you still need to be traveling for an essential or non-discretionary purpose, you must also have a valid study permit, so the actual study permit document, not just the letter of introduction, or have been approved for a study permit and be holding a letter of introduction that was issued on or before March 18th, 2020. So either valid study permit regardless of issue date, or letter of introduction or study permit approval letter that was issued on or before March 18th. You must also have a temporary resident visa or ETA if you require one. Now, getting to the non-discretionary travel piece, regardless of where you'll be traveling to Canada from, you must demonstrate that the purpose of your travel is essential or non-discretionary. So the onus will be on you to satisfy an officer at the port of entry that your purpose for traveling to Canada is essential. That is to say, your physical presence in Canada is necessary at this time. According to IRCC's program delivery instructions released earlier this week, it's been a busy week, Border Services officers will assess the circumstances surrounding a student's travel and consider some of the following factors. For example, whether they are established residing and studying in Canada. So if a student is already established in Canada, their return essentially home is considered to be non-discretionary. That means if you've already been living here and can prove you're established, then returning to your primary residence in Canada is okay. They'll also consider whether a student is expected to begin studying upon arrival after completing their quarantine, whether their presence in Canada is necessary for their continued participation in the program, such as laboratories or workshops, or any courses that require in-person attendance and participation. They will factor in whether pursuing online studies is not an option for the student's school or program, or is not possible from their home country. So for example, due to internet restrictions, bandwidth limitations, They'll also consider whether the semester has been canceled or the person will begin studying later in the year. So that might be grounds to consider the travel as discretionary or optional. Keep in mind as well that a border services officer and not IRCC will make a final determination on your eligibility to enter Canada at the port of entry when you arrive. I understand that many of you have questions about whether you'll be able to travel to Canada for the fall term. And unfortunately, we might not have a clear-cut answer for you. I really, really wish we did. And ultimately, it will be up to the Border Services Officer to determine if you meet the travel exemptions, if you're coming back for an essential purpose, and if you have a quarantine plan in place. So if you're considering traveling at this time and you would like a more authoritative opinion on your eligibility to do so, I would always recommend consulting with the Canada Border Services Agency via their Border Information Service before finalizing your travel plans. Like I said, our office will also be hosting another online session on the topic of travel considerations on August 7th, which might be of interest to you. And hopefully at that point, we'll have more updates to share since the current travel restrictions will by then either have been extended or changed or both. By August 7th, we should know more. With regard to the self-isolation requirements, to comply with the order under the Quarantine Act that's currently in place until August 31st, 2020, but may be extended, all international travelers arriving in Canada, with very, very few exceptions, must quarantine for 14 days, even if you don't have any symptoms related to COVID-19. You will need to submit a self-isolation plan to both the federal and provincial governments, and it's recommended that you do this in advance. It's your responsibility to make the necessary arrangements so that you can appropriately quarantine for 14 days after you arrive, and your ability to do so will be assessed by the officer at the port of entry upon arrival. I think someone is not muted. So if everyone can please check their mic and just make sure that it's muted, that would be great. Thank you. Now, before we stop the recording and open up the floor for questions, I'd just like to leave you with a quick recap of some key points. So first, study permit applications must be submitted online at this time. And again, we recommend that you apply as soon as possible if you have not done so already. With the recent updates, if your study permit application is submitted before September 15th, you might be eligible for the temporary two-stage approval process, which can provide some reassurance as to your eligibility for a study permit. However, there's no guarantee and no one can predict the outcome of your study permit application. So even an approval in principle doesn't guarantee that you will receive full approval. So to minimize the chance of last-minute disappointments or complications with your study plan, we strongly recommend that you apply for your study permit as soon as possible. Once your application is submitted, remote studies completed outside Canada in the fall term will be counted towards the eligibility and length of the post-graduation work permit, according to what IRCC has announced, as long as you will meet all the other requirements and receive full approval for your study permit at a later date. You can also visit our website, which contains a wealth of information on the process, as well as our COVID-19 FAQs for international students, which we update as new information becomes available. In addition, we have some welcome guides for new students, which include some step-by-step checklists of items to take care of as you prepare to join us at SFU. And if you're not sure where to start when it comes to the mandatory quarantine requirement, you can also refer to our new self-isolation guide. I would also highly recommend that you closely monitor the travel restrictions and exemptions on the Government of Canada website for the most up-to-date information on the restrictions and the requirements for entry into Canada. So as I mentioned, maybe a couple of times now, this is the first of several sessions that we're offering to our new grad students on various topics. So I hope you'll be able to join us for our upcoming sessions, including medical insurance and supports on July 30th and travel considerations on August 7th as well. And of course, for those watching the recording, if you have questions after watching the video and reviewing our web resources, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. So at this point, we'll be moving on to the Q&A portion of the session. I'll be ending the recording now. So to those of you watching the recorded session, thank you for watching. We're so excited to welcome you to SFU in whatever form that may take this year.